Oftentimes, there's just no way to start this with a bang, so it's like I have to start explaining right off the bat. Oftentimes, historical events have layers of meaning, particularly important historical events. And the reason why I mention that is because in the Gospel of John was like the last gospel written. And there was time most people would say the Gospel of John was written somewhere around 80 or 90 AD. So that's like 40 years after Jesus, 50 years after Jesus, after he died and so on. So the point is that there's lots of time for reflection of the writer of the Gospel of John. And when he writes what he writes, his gospel is different than all the other gospels. And it's because there's these layers of meaning. He's had time to think on all of these things that he's writing about, and the way that he writes them shapes them in such a way that there's depth to it. That it's more than just the reporting of historical events. There's theology in the reporting of the historical events. Boy, I just wish there was a really good way to say that. Here's an example. We have the same thing. When there's a historical event that we consider to be important, there's always multi-layers to it. So for example, when Osama bin Laden was killed in 2011, was it? That becomes a noteworthy event for more than just the fact that he was a terrorist who was killed. Right? Because terrorists are killed every day, presumably somewhere in the world. So, and they don't all make the news, but Osama bin Laden makes the news because he was the one who masterminded the 9/11 plots on when the planes crashed into the buildings at the World Trade Center in New York. He was also behind a number of other plots, and so it was him that sort of changed the world by the evil that he did. He started the war on terror. That's when we first started to talk about the war on terror. And so when he's killed and done away with, that's noteworthy. And it's more than just a historical event. There's also layers of meaning underneath there. In the same way, with the Gospel of John, the events that are recorded have layers of meaning because of the way that they're written. All right? So I want to look at that today and look at this text about Jesus turning the water into wine. And the first thing that we need to talk about a little bit is wedding feasts. In our day and age, weddings are pretty much family and immediate friends' affairs. In Jesus' day, wedding feasts were for the whole village. Everybody in the village was coming to all the wedding feasts. It was a large affair. It was probably the most important thing that happened to a couple in their life. To signify that, they dressed in special garments, just like we do today, tuxedos and dresses, but they also were given a special status in the community. So during the week, 5 to 7 days that the feast lasted, they were like the king and the queen. And they could, it was like being, what was that old television show, Queen for a Day? Does anybody remember that show? I just barely remembered that show. But they were like king and queen for the week. And they could, say, I'd like some more something, and people would go get it for them. Or I'd like to have, people would do the housework for them. It was a wonderful time. It was an important time in people's lives. The whole community was involved. There was a downside to that. Because if the if the groom and his family didn't provide a large enough and good enough ceremony, then people would be kind of upset. You can see that, if the whole community is involved, and if so-and-so has a wedding that lasts 4 days, and they don't have very much wine, and the food is of an inferior quality, they have it catered in by McDonald's or something, instead of, Riverview Banquet Center, which is the ultimate, then, people could get a little offended. In fact, there was precedent for people, if they felt like the groom's family didn't make enough of an effort, they could actually sue the groom's family if the wedding feast wasn't a big enough deal. So you had to be careful about how you did a wedding feast. And you had to make sure that it was an event that everybody wanted to be at and that there were no social faux pas involved. So, Jesus goes to a wedding feast. And the wedding feast is going on like all wedding feasts do. And the wine runs out. And the first thing I have to tell you is, I have heard this before again and again, it's not true. People will say, when they talk about wine, what they're really talking about is unfermented grape juice. Because they don't like the idea that Jesus makes alcoholic beverages. There's a certain kind of Christian that thinks alcoholic beverages, that's no good. And they can't believe Jesus would do that, so they figure out some way to make it so that he's not doing something bad. Particularly it says later on, they waited to do this until everybody had been drinking freely, which is a way of saying they've had a lot to drink. They've been drinking at this wedding feast for a couple of days now. And usually when that happens, you bring out the cheap stuff, because nobody cares anymore. It's all good. It's MD 2020. After you've had a couple of days of drinking, who cares? Really? You don't need the Merlot. Anyway, people don't like the idea that Jesus did that, and so they say, well, it can't have been wine. It must have been unfermented grape juice. Listen, think about it. You don't have to have the script. You can't support that from the Bible. But think about it. The only way you can stop grape juice when it's first squeezed from fermenting is to either heat it and pasteurize it, which stops that process, or freeze it or do something to it. But they didn't have the capability to do that in those days. So all grape juice, when it was squeezed, immediately began fermenting. So get it out of your heads that Jesus, actually did sparkling champagne or something, that was non-alcoholic. It wasn't like that. Jesus made wine. Wine, the rabbis, by the way, said that without wine, there was no gladness. That's why you had to have wine at a wedding feast. If you didn't have wine, who's going to be able to celebrate? Because, it says in Psalm 104:15, look it up if you don't believe me, wine is one of the gifts of God that gladdens the heart of man. So you had to have wine at these kinds of celebrations. The point is this: Jesus made a lot of wine. We'll get there in a minute. 6 stone water pots that had 20 or 30 gallons each. So you do the math. They filled them up to the brim. 6 times, let's say 20, just to be on the safe side. 120 gallons. It's a lot of wine, don't you think? 120 gallons, that lasts us a couple of weeks anyway. He made lots of wine. What does this tell us about Jesus? Because what I've been telling you about so far is just the historical events. These are the facts as they happen. And there's a whole study about how this has all of the earmarks of an eyewitness event. The people that wrote this, the gospel, the writer who wrote this was there when it happened. There's all kinds of little telltale signs for that I won't bore you with. But most people say this is a historical event. So far, I've been talking about just the historical things. Jesus and his disciples go to a wedding feast. The groom and his family apparently are disorganized. They got married pretty young in those days. Like girls would get married when they were 13, 14, 15 years old. Boys the same. So you got a couple of teenagers putting on a feast, and they don't know how much wine people are going to drink. They don't know that Uncle so-and-so, he can drink a gallon by himself in a day. So they miscalculate or something, and because of that, they've got egg on their face, there's embarrassment, there's a social faux pas, and they've run out of wine. And Jesus' mother, Mary, says, do something about it, and he does, and there's the story. All right, what does it tell us about Jesus? What does it tell us about Jesus that he does that? Well, it tells us, number one, that he's concerned enough about our lives to be concerned about the little details of our lives. Just even to, how would you say this? Wipe the egg off the face of a couple of disorganized teenagers. There's nothing too small for him. There's nothing that he isn't concerned about in our lives. Even if it's just a little social embarrassment, Jesus is concerned about it. God is concerned about our lives. It also tells us that he is, even deeper than that, he's the Lord of the feast. The reason why I had that text read in the Old Testament is because that was a messianic text. That was one of those texts that people said, that's what's going to happen when the Messiah comes. There's going to be a great feast, a great banquet, and there's going to be choice meats and foods, and there's going to be aged wine, fine wine. When the Messiah comes, the world is going to be involved in a big banquet at the final day. Jesus, by providing the wine for this wedding feast, this is his calling card, so to speak. This is the first way that he says, it's me. I'm the Messiah. This is his first miracle. And I think it's significant that the first thing that he does is make something that in the scriptures is said to bring joy to the hearts of human beings. So this is Jesus' calling card. He's the true Lord of the feast. He's the true Messiah prophesied about in the Old Testament, who brings the coming messianic banquet at the beginning. When he's present, the thing is started. Now, obviously, it hasn't come in its fullness yet, but it's already there with him at the wedding feast. So the kingdom of God is likened in the Old Testament to a wedding feast, and Jesus is saying, here's my calling card, it's me. I'm making the down payment of the wine that's going to flow in rivers on the final days. It's his calling card. It also tells us that the Christian life, at its heart, at its root, is to be a life of joy. Because of the wine. And the rabbis and what they said about wine, and the scriptures and what they say about wine. Wine is always a symbol for joy. So the fact that Jesus' first miracle involves making a ton of wine for a wedding feast is a way of saying this is supposed to be at heart a happy thing. Being a Christian is supposed to be a joyful thing. Now, it does not mean that every day is happy, 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 because we all know that that's not true. There are some Christians who try to convince you that their lives are all happy, happy, brightness and light all the time, but it's not true. Because we live in the in-between times. Jesus started the great banquet, but it's not come in its fullness yet. And so we're waiting for the fulfillment of the banquet, and in the waiting times, there's difficulty and pain and sorrow. In fact, we're told in a hymn that comes from the scriptures that Jesus was a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. So it's here, but it's not fully here yet. Christians don't turn a blind eye to suffering and pain. We don't turn a deaf ear to those crying and calling for help. These things are real, and we as Christians deal with them. But the heart of it, the deepest reality for a Christian is for joy. Think about this for a second. All of the significant processes that we need for life are not painful. Did you ever think about that? It's not painful to eat. Thank goodness. Or nobody would have any weight problems, I suppose. If it was a drag to eat food, God made us so that the thing that sustains us is pleasurable. We get pleasure out of eating most of the time. Procreation. There, I've got your attention. Sex is not painful for human beings. Just the opposite. There are creatures, I know that there are some spiders that after they procreate, the female devours the male. That's not good. At least that's not the kind of woman I want to marry. Procreation is a pleasurable thing. God made us that way. The heart of the way that we're supposed to be as people is a pleasurable experience and not a painful experience. The deepest experience that we have is an experience of joy. That's the thing that we're called to. And I think that the way God made us and the way God made the world points to that. And Jesus' provision of wine is testimony to that. The jars themselves point to that. I mentioned there's 6 stone jars there used for Jewish purification rites. What they did was before the Jews entered any religious or social occasion, which a wedding fits both bills, and before they went to worship at the temple, there was water jars, and they had to wash their hands and their feet, which symbolized the cleansing and release of sin, so they could come purely into God's presence. There's that old phrase that says, cleanliness is next to godliness. I don't think they meant to say that, being clean was inherently better than being dirty, because that means if you're out in your shop and you're working and you get all dirty, then that's not a good thing. No, that's not saying that. What it's saying is that to come into God's presence, we need to be clean and pure. And so they washed themselves. And Jesus takes that water, that bunch of minimum 120 gallons of water, and turns it into joy. So the Christian life becomes not a duty of following rites, but it becomes a life of joy with Christ. You see how that transition works? And that is one of those layers of meaning that's in this text, that people have been seeing that kind of stuff since the 3rd century. That the Christian life is meant to be not a life of just duty, grind it out. How many of us have this idea that the Christian life is like, just say no, put your mind to it, suck it up, stiff upper lip, just do the right thing, just do it. How many, that doesn't sound very appealing to me anyway, if it's just a matter of duty. And that's why I think Jesus takes that whole symbolic thing of duty and religious rites and turns it into the wine of joy, to bring gladness to people's hearts. It's a way of saying that the Jewish rites of purification have been transformed and fulfilled in Christ, and now the reality of the joy of the Christian life is present. The question becomes, how do we enter into that? How do we enter into that joy that's supposed to be at the heart of all things? There's a couple things I think we need to see. What's the first thing that Mary says about the problem with the wine? Anybody remember? The first thing about the wine. They ran out. The first thing of entering into the joy of the new wine is to admit we're out. We don't have any. We're out of wine. We're out of joy. We're not where we should be. In other words, it's a matter of acknowledging the need that you live in. Acknowledging that I can't do this on my own. Acknowledging that just calling people to do what they're supposed to do doesn't get the job done. Just coming down harder on people with the law is another theological way of saying it, doesn't do it. The first step is to acknowledge, I'm out. I don't have any joy. I'm morally, theologically, spiritually bankrupt. I'm out. Can't do any more. And some of us, it's a hard time coming to that place before God, because we all have things that we want to hold on to. We all have goodness in our lives that we think if we just bring that to God and show Him, He'll be delighted with us and He'll reward us by giving us joy. That's the legalistic way of doing it. It doesn't work that way. It's a matter of acknowledging I don't have what it takes. I'm out. And then, the next thing that Mary says to Jesus is that she recognizes that He can do something about it. She says to Him, they don't have any more wine. He says back to her, woman, why do you involve me with this? It is kind of a short thing to say. It is kind of being short with your mother. Most commentators say that what's happening here is that since this is the beginning of Jesus' ministry, he's making a transition from being under the authority of his mother and calling her mom and saying, okay, mom, I'll do it. He's making a transition into an adult person and saying, woman, why are you involving me? It's not my time yet. So in a little dialogue there, he's come out from under her authority as a parent and a mother and saying, it's not my time yet, I'm an adult, I'm grown up, I'll do this in my time, in my own way. That's just one way that people explain it. The point is this: how many times do you go to Christ or in prayer to God and say, Lord, I'm empty, I'm out, I need something. And God gives you the brush off. Have you ever felt like that? I pray like that a lot. Pray for weeks sometimes about something. Pray for months. Pray for years about something. And it's obvious he's not listening. Because nothing is happening with the thing that I'm asking about. You feel like he's giving you the brush off. I think that's probably what Mary felt like. What? Wait a minute. Woman? Excuse me, I'm your mother. I don't think Jesus is being disrespectful. I just think he's making that transition. And all of a sudden, Mary says, look, they don't have any more wine. And Jesus says, not right now. Gives her the brush off. But what does Mary do then? Does Mary go stomp off in a huff? Well, talk to your mother like that? No. She says to the servants, do whatever he tells you. In other words, she knows that he can do something about the situation. She doesn't understand why he's telling her no right now, but he tells the servants, do whatever he tells you. She still trusts him. And good things happen when that happens. It may take a little while. Picture this. We all know this story, but try to put yourself in the middle of this story. Mary says they don't have any wine. Jesus says, not right now. Mary says to the servants, do whatever he tells you. And Jesus says, fill up those stone water pots over there with water. And then take some to the master of the feast. If you're one of those servants, or if you're Mary, you're thinking, what good is that going to do? Filling them up with water? Who cares? They're out of wine. Didn't you hear me say they're out of wine? And yet, they do it and the miracle happens. What that, I think, means for us is we go to God, we ask him for things, we get the brush off, and then he tells us to do something that you think, what's that got to do with anything? Just like he did here. And then here's the last thing that I think is really a great thing, is that you have to take credit for everything that Jesus did for you. You have to take credit for what he does for you. You have to enter into what he does for you. Think about this. Here's the bridegroom. He and his bride are sitting at the main table, the kings and the queens of the banquet, and they're out of wine. People are starting to talk a little bit, and things are looking bad. There's going to be a socially embarrassing situation, and then some servants come up with some wine, with some water that they've drawn out of the water pots. Who knows when it turned into wine? They bring it to the master of ceremonies. The master of ceremonies tastes it and says, wow, this is great. This is the best wine I've ever tasted. He looks at the bridegroom in the text and says, you've saved the best until now. The bridegroom, if he's me, goes, yeah. What do you expect? You think I'm some kind of a chump or something? Yeah. There's no hint that Jesus ever gets credit for this. The bridegroom gets the credit that Jesus did. The bridegroom enters into what Jesus did for him. You see that? The bridegroom, who is completely out, has all of his needs met, and he gets credit for the goodness of Jesus. That's a picture of the Christian life. That's a picture of how we go to God bankrupt. Say, Lord, I can't do this anymore. And he gives you the brush off. Then he tells you to do things that you think, that's pointless. How about, like, here's one. Lord, I'm not feeling any joy. I don't know if I believe anymore. He doesn't say anything for a long time, and then you start to think, well, maybe I should go to church. Go to church? What's that got to do with anything? Well, it has a lot to do with some things. And then, when you go to church, or when you go to the gospel, you hear what God has done for you, and you say, yes, I want that for me. And the credit of the work that Jesus has done comes to you through no desert of your own. Think about that today as you're coming to the Lord's Supper. This is all what God has done for you in Christ. And none of us were even born when this happened. So we're all entering into something that Jesus has done, that God has done for us way before we were even a gleam in our parents' eye. As exciting as that must have been for our parents. Because remember the first one, procreation is pleasure. Before we were even thought of, this was done on our behalf, and we enter into it. And we get credit for what Christ has done. And we receive it gratefully by faith. Let's close in a word of prayer.